The ancient handbag of the gods, what archaeologists actually know. Picture a small stone carving, barely bigger than your hand, tucked into the corner of a museum case that most visitors walk straight past. Now picture that same shape, the same curved handle, the same square little body, showing up again on a palace wall 1,000 years later, and again on a temple gate on the other side of the planet, thousands of years after that. That is a real thing sitting in real museums right now, and for the last 2 decades it has quietly become one of the most argued about images in ancient art. Some people call it decoration. Some people call it proof of something the history books left out. Today we're going to look at what it actually is, what archaeologists actually say about it, and why a simple carved bucket became one of the internet's favorite mysteries. Let's start where the image itself starts, in Sumer, in the flat river plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates that historians still call the cradle of civilization. This part is not speculation. Around 5,000 years ago, the people of Sumer built the first cities with real populations, developed the first known writing system, wrote some of the earliest law codes we have, and worked out a system of mathematics based on units of 60 that we still use every time we look at a clock. None of that needs embellishing. It's already remarkable on its own, and it's the foundation everything else in this story sits on top of. In Sumerian and later Assyrian art, you start seeing a recurring pair of objects carried by winged, larger-than-life figures. In one hand, they usually hold a small cone-shaped object. In the other, held down at the side, is a small rectangular container with a curved handle on top. Archaeologists generally refer to this container as a situla, which is just the Latin word for bucket, or sometimes simply describe it as a sacred bucket in the literature. You can find versions of this pairing on cylinder seals from early Sumer, on the stele of the vultures, one of the oldest war monuments ever excavated, and most famously on the massive stone reliefs from the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, built around the 9th century BCE. In those palace reliefs, the winged figures are shown standing beside a stylized tree, touching it with a cone as though anointing or pollinating it, while the bucket hangs at their side. Who are these winged figures supposed to be? In Mesopotamian religious texts, they're generally identified with a group of legendary sages called the Apkallu. Ancient texts describe the Apkallu as wise beings sent, in the mythology, before and after a great flood to teach humanity the foundations of civilization: writing, law, agriculture, architecture, the measurement of time. Some later texts list them by name and associate each one with a particular king, or a particular skill they supposedly imparted. In Mesopotamian religious thought, these figures were closely tied to Enki, the god associated with wisdom, freshwater, and craft. This is well documented in the surviving cuneiform texts, and mainstream Assyriologists treat the Apkallu tradition the same way they treat any other piece of ancient mythology, as a genuine and important part of how the Mesopotamians explained their own origins, not as a literal historical record of visiting beings. Now here's the part where the story usually gets pulled in 2 very different directions, and it's worth being upfront about both of them before we go any further. On one side, you have mainstream archaeology, which generally interprets the bucket and cone as ritual implements, tools for purification or fertility rite connected to the sacred tree motif, something similar in spirit to a priest sprinkling holy water today. The consistent shape isn't treated as mysterious. It's treated the way you'd treat any religious symbol used by trained artisans working from established templates within a shared visual tradition, similar to how a chalice or a shepherd's crook keeps a recognizable shape across centuries of religious art because it's a specific object with a specific function, made by craftspeople trained in a specific convention. On the other side, starting mainly in the 1970s with writers like Zachariah Sitchin and later joined by Eric von Daniken, and a long line of documentary hosts and YouTube channels after them, there's a very different reading. This is the ancient astronaut interpretation, and it argues that the Apkallu weren't sages or gods at all but visitors, and that the bucket and cone were actual pieces of equipment, sometimes described as tools, sometimes as ritual objects with a technological origin, brought by beings who genuinely taught early human skills like writing and mathematics. It's an appealing story, partly because it takes something the Sumerians already said about themselves, that their knowledge came from outside, and reads it as literally as possible. It's important to be honest about where that theory stands scientifically, because this is exactly the point where a lot of online content quietly stops being honest. The ancient astronaut interpretation is not accepted by mainstream archaeology, Assyriology, or any peer-reviewed academic field studying Mesopotamia. It isn't a fringe minority position within serious scholarship. It exists almost entirely outside of it, in popular books and media, rather than in academic journals. That doesn't automatically make it wrong in some metaphysical sense, but it does mean there is no rigorous, peer-reviewed cross-continental measurement study of this object, no research team that quietly cataloged 350 carvings with calipers and found identical ratios across 4 continents, and no credentialed lead analyst who called the results frankly unsettling on the record. That specific narrative, however dramatic it sounds, is a popular internet retelling, not a documented piece of research. If you go looking for it, what you'll actually find is individual writers and video creators working independently, pointing at photographs and asserting similarity, which is a very different thing from a controlled scientific study. That distinction matters more than it might seem because human beings are extraordinarily good at spotting patterns, even ones that aren't really there. It's a well-documented tendency called pattern recognition bias, or sometimes apophenia, and it's the same mental shortcut that makes people see a face in a wood grain or a constellation in a random scatter of stars. A small rectangular object with a curved handle is, honestly, not a complicated shape. It's close to the most natural, efficient design for a portable container that exists, which is exactly why baskets, pails, and bags across completely unconnected human cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, tend to converge on similar proportions without needing any contact at all. Convergent design, independent invention of broadly similar tools and shapes by cultures that never met, is one of the most well-established patterns in archaeology. Pyramids were built independently in Egypt and in Mesoamerica thousands of years apart, using completely different construction methods, for different religious reasons, and nobody argues that requires a shared origin. A basic bucket shape converging across cultures is, if anything, a far smaller coincidence than that. There's also a deeper problem with stretching this image across continents the way some popular videos do, and it's simply a matter of chronology and evidence. Carvings from Sumer and Assyria are separated from Mesoamerican art by not just an ocean but by thousands of years and by civilizations that developed writing systems, calendars, agriculture, and religious iconography completely independently of one another, with no archaeological evidence of trade goods, shared vocabulary, genetic contact, or transmitted technology between them. When historians do establish real contact between ancient cultures, whether it's trade along the Silk Road or Phoenician sailors reaching distant Mediterranean shores, that contact leaves a trail. Shared pottery styles, loanwords, imported materials, genetic evidence, written records of the exchange itself. No comparable trail connects Sumerian religious art to Mesoamerican religious art. A visual resemblance between two carved objects, on its own, isn't that kind of trail. It's a resemblance, and resemblances need much stronger supporting evidence before they become a historical claim. None of that means the real object isn't worth talking about, though, because on its own terms, without any of the embellishment, it's still a genuinely interesting piece of ancient religious symbolism. The Apkala tradition tells us something real and fascinating about how the Sumerians understood their own history. They didn't credit themselves alone for their achievements. They told a story in which wisdom arrived from somewhere else, delivered by figures who came, taught, and departed. That's a powerful piece of mythology in its own right, and it's part of a much broader human pattern. Cultures across the ancient world, from the Greek myth of Prometheus bringing fire, to Norse stories of Odin sacrificing himself for knowledge of the runes, to Chinese legends of cultural heroes teaching agriculture and medicine, keep returning to the same basic idea: that civilization was a gift, not something invented from nothing. The Mesopotamian version, with its winged sages and their strange little buckets, is simply one of the oldest surviving examples of that very old human instinct. It's also worth saying plainly that the sites and civilizations involved in this story are real and remarkable without any need for exaggeration. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey genuinely is one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the last century, a set of monumental carved stone pillars built roughly 11,000 years ago, before agriculture, before pottery, before writing, by people archaeologists still describe as hunter-gatherers. That site alone rewrote a lot of assumptions about how early large-scale religious construction could be, and it doesn't need an unrelated bucket motif attached to it to be extraordinary. Tiwanaku in Bolivia, home to the famous Gateway of the Sun, is a genuinely important pre-Columbian Andean site with its own rich, independently developed religious iconography, including a prominent central figure holding staffs and other ceremonial items. Ancient Mesoamerican civilizations like the Olmec and later the Maya produced staggeringly sophisticated art, astronomy, and writing systems entirely on their own. Every one of these cultures deserves to be understood on its own terms for what it actually accomplished, rather than treated as a supporting character in a story about a single traveling object. So, where does that leave the actual mystery, the honest version of it? It leaves us with a real, striking, and still slightly puzzling recurring motif in ancient Near Eastern religious art: a bucket and a cone, carried by winged sage figures tied to one of humanity's oldest surviving mythologies about the origin of knowledge. It leaves us with a genuinely interesting question that mainstream Assyriologists still discuss, about exactly what ritual function the bucket and cone served in Mesopotamian religious practice, whether it was purification, fertility, or something tied to the sacred tree imagery specifically. What it doesn't leave us with is a verified, peer-reviewed scientific study proving an identical object appeared on 4 continents across 11,000 years, or hard evidence of contact between civilizations that history otherwise shows no sign ever met. That version of the story is compelling television, but it is an established fact, and it's worth knowing the difference, especially in a corner of the internet where the line between the two gets blurred on purpose, because the blurred version gets more views. There's a reason stories like this spread so easily, and it isn't really about gullibility. It's because the real history is already strange enough to be uncomfortable. A civilization that genuinely did invent writing and law and advanced mathematics 5,000 years ago, and then turned around and said, quite plainly in its own religious texts, that this knowledge had come from somewhere outside itself. That's an unsettling detail all on its own, without anyone needing to add extra evidence that was never actually collected. Maybe the more interesting question isn't whether some lost civilization or visiting teacher really carried that little stone bucket across the ancient world. Maybe it's why so many completely unrelated human cultures, across thousands of years, kept telling themselves some version of the same story, that everything they built, they didn't build entirely alone. So here's the honest version to leave you with. The bucket is real. The Apkala mythology is real and genuinely fascinating. The idea that it's scientifically verified proof of ancient contact between Sumer and Mesoamerica is not supported by mainstream archaeology, and no rigorous study of the kind often described online actually exists. What we're left with instead is something a little quieter, but arguably just as compelling: a 5,000-year-old civilization that built the foundations of writing, law, and mathematics and chose, in its own sacred texts, to tell the story of where that knowledge came from rather than simply claiming all the credit for itself. Tell me honestly, does the real, well-documented history feel less interesting to you than the version with the secret research team, or does it actually hit harder knowing this part is true? Let me know in the comments, and if you want more deep dives that separate what's genuinely documented from what just sounds good in a video, stick around.